Bonjour, this is Fabulously Delicious, the French food podcast. It's the podcast that's all about the cuisine that is said to have founded modern cooking. French ingredients and dishes have been the starting blocks for many of the world's best chefs and cooks. And on Fabulously Delicious, we'll learn all about those dishes and ingredients, as well as get to know more about fabulous French foodies. I'm your host, Andrew Pryor. Enchanté!
Enchanté.
My life changed when I competed on MasterChef Australia, and now I'm living my best life right here in the French countryside. Well, actually, technically not right here because this is a friend's house, but in my house back in Montmorillon in the Vienne department of France. This one's in Brittany and it's just gorgeous. Cooking, eating, meeting wonderful local producers, chefs, home cooks, drinking amazing wines, eating some of the would you believe there's more than 1,500 French cheeses? And sharing these fabulous experiences with you, my fabulously delicious audience. That's what my life's all about now, and I hope you enjoy them. The Olympics was just a fabulous experience to see in Paris. And the Paralympics, well, they're about to start soon. So I wanted to celebrate by revisiting an episode of Fabulously Delicious that I did with Alec Lobrano, a famed and fabulous restaurant and food writer, and what he had to say about Paris restaurants in particular. Alec even gave me a fabulous recommendations in the guide, Paris, a fabulous food guide to the world's most delicious city. So if you want that, check it out via my website. Sit back, turn up the volume. If you're not driving, pour yourself a glass of wine, break a baguette, add a bit of saucisse on maybe, and some of that delicious cheese, and enjoy today's episode of Fabulously Delicious, the French food podcast, as we revisit Paris restaurants with Alec Lobrano.
Well, one of my favorite restaurants was right on the Quai d'Orsay. It was called the Quai d'Orsay, and it was one of the first places that I ever went and had a meal by myself, which was quite an experience because I did not come from a culture where people went to restaurants alone.
Alec, you've written an autobiography in your latest book, My Place at the Table, is that right?
That's right.
It recounts how you came to Paris, found yourself, so to speak, and became a fabulous food writer and critic. I want to ask you about Paris restaurants. There's a lot of information out there about the history of restaurants in Paris. So first up, I wanted to ask you, what is the oldest restaurant in Paris, and is it still running?
Well, that title is sort of disputed. I mean, there's a couple of different people who would claim to be the oldest restaurant in Paris. I'm not going to say the name of the place that actually may be the oldest one in Paris because somebody might hear it and forget that I said not to go there. So,
Okay. I was going to ask that. So what's the food like and should we go there? That was going to be my next question.
No, absolutely not. And I know what it's like because I love listening to podcasts. And you know, you glean. I mean, nobody's attention span is focused all the time. So you glean bits and pieces of things and go away with these crumbs, and then. But no, I mean, restaurants really began after the French Revolution when all of these chefs were looking for work. And restaurant, as you know, means to restore. Restaurer is to restore. And in this instance, it was the idea of, restoring your health or nourishing you. And a lot of these were almost like soup restaurants that started up with different types of bouillon that were garnished variously. And, the concept grew from there. I mean, as France was much slower than England to industrialize, but, as Paris grew, I mean, there were always places, there were charcutier. I mean, charcutier always people didn't have ovens. So, you'd go to buy a baked ham from the charcutier because you didn't have an oven at home. There were always places to go and buy food, going deep into the Middle Ages in Paris, cooked food. But the idea of actually going somewhere and sitting down at a table and allowing someone who you didn't know to cook for you really began in earnest after the French Revolution.
We talked to Lisa Anselmo about bouillons. It came up with a topic about how they were there to feed the masses and became very popular during the world fairs in Paris. And then, of course, in the 20s and 30s were sort of zhuzhed up, so to speak, and became the in thing to do. But Are there other important moments in history for Paris restaurants, like the World Fair?
Absolutely. I mean, the Paris restaurant scene is a reflection. I mean, for example, the brasseries, which after the Franco-Prussian War, when Germany annexed Alsace and part of Lorraine, there were created a stream of refugees that left eastern France. Some of them ended up in Paris. One of them opened Beaufanger, which is a brasserie, and the word brasserie, of course, means brewery. This is an Alsatian tradition of having a simple tavern where you could have something simple to eat at next to a brewery and also drink freshly brewed beer. The actual breweries themselves didn't migrate to Paris, but the brewing tradition of serving food with beer came with these people. And the brasseries they arrived in Paris just at the right time because the train network of France was being built out, which suddenly made it possible for people to go up to Paris for a day or a weekend or whatever. So there were more people coming in who were hungry, and there were it was expanding the clientele, and brasseries became very, very popular. And I still love them because I think there's a great metropolitan glamour attached to them. And they're democratic too because you can go in and just have a bowl of onion soup. Um, but the brasseries were also, they really came into their own during the Universal Exposition of 1900. And what we know of as Paris today, the image of Paris that we all have in our heads today, was created very carefully by the French government to reflect the prowess of French industry and the superiority of French culture on the occasion of the 1900 Universal Exposition. Many, many, many hotels were built. They sold they sold packages in Spain, Italy, Germany, all over the place. You could pay off over the course of 2.5 years. They wanted you desperately to come to Paris. To have all these people flooding into the city, you had to have some place to feed them. And so that's why, for example, the Le Train Bleu, which was not originally called Le Train Bleu, but it was all the brasseries sprung up around train stations because people were coming in. The train stations became great nerve centers for business travelers and tourists and other things. Tourism, as it began in earnest with Thomas Cook and all the rest of it, also provided a clientele. I mean, the history of uh, how the French or the Paris restaurant scene grew and evolved is very much a reflection of economic and historical events.
Has Paris always been about French food, or has there been a history of other cuisines that have taken the city by storm in the past?
In my lifetime, I think that before it was other cuisines, it was the arrival, again related to the railroads, of regional kitchens of France suddenly arriving in Paris. Because, for example, when people used to monter à Paris, go up to Paris to try and make your fortune, whether you were coming from Burgundy or the Auvergne or whatever it was, clusters of people started cooking their regional cooking. And I think it was the regional kitchens of France that first created different fashions. I mean, when people became smitten with Burgundian cooking, they didn't know it before. I mean, Parisian cooking was very much made with produce from the Ile-de-France, and it was an idiom of its own as the foods of other parts of the other France arrived in Paris. People were fascinated by them, and some, liked some of them and liked others less. I mean, Provençal cooking, Southern French cooking, was sort of, people looked down their noses at it for a long time because it was not common to use olive oil in the north of France, and it was considered coarse. Cooking with butter was considered more refined. But so, again, to answer your question, I think before it became a question of different world cuisines, it was a question of other different French regional cuisines. And there were occasional European restaurants of other European countries. I mean, there would be a Swiss restaurant, with that specialized in specialities with cheese and things. The occasional sad little German restaurant with sausages and what have you. I think that if France was really admiring of another kitchen, it was Austria for a long time, because Austria, as the rival of France for a long time, and many Austrian dishes finally did enter into the canon of French cooking, beginning with croissant, of course, which really were Viennese. Um, but then going through a lot of other things, I mean, what the French call, for example, bœuf à la ficelle is Tafelspitz. I mean, it's poaching a piece of beef in bouillon, and that was one of the Austrian emperor's favorite dish. The French um, loved Austrian food. So I think that was one of the largest influences. And then with immigration, as France continued to industrialize and needed strong arms and its factories and mines and farms, and more Spanish and Italian people came to live and work in France. There was some interest by that, but I remember, for example, I mean, the in the shops when I first came to Paris, there'd be one miserable little dusty shelf that would have foreign foods, things that you'd need to make Italian food, or God forbid, something Spanish or Portuguese. Um,
What was the biggest difference between Paris in 1986 to when you first came to Paris pre-pandemic?
um, Paris was very the restaurant scene was very hierarchical. I mean, it was shaped like a Christmas tree. I mean, at the top of the three-star restaurants, then the two stars and the one stars were for business things, and then there were the brasserie, which were I still like brasseries, even though they've become too expensive and the food's not good. At the bottom, the great sturdy bottom was the wonderful bistros. Um, and there were some foreign restaurants, but they were more. I mean, the foreign restaurants in Paris, coming from New York, where I'd lived before, and Boston and London, the foreign food in Paris is dreadful. Aside from North Africa, and there was some good North African cooking, but the Italian food was hateful, and um, there was some okay Vietnamese food, but it was frankly, it was very provincial. I mean, it was a very hierarchical, that sort of Christmas tree shaped thing. And there were a couple of famous chefs, but mostly the chefs were anonymous and stayed in their kitchens. The food that one ate on a regular basis was French. And, you know, um, when people went out for lunch, when I was still doing that office job, you'd have a steak frite and a little glass of red wine down the corner. Um, there was no, munching sandwiches in front of computer terminals and things like that. I mean, it was in many ways it was, and it was also before, and this is very important, I think, Andrew. It was before the 35 heures, the 35-hour work week. When that came in, it had an absolutely horrible impact on Paris restaurants, because you could no longer. It became prohibitively expensive to keep somebody in the kitchen all afternoon, which is what you need to do to make certain types of dishes. I mean, when you cook, and I love to cook as well. I mean, I'll wander to the kitchen in the middle of the afternoon to skim a sauce or stir something or taste something or just see how it's getting on. Restaurants couldn't afford to do that anymore. And so, what was um, in 1986, that traditional French cooking, which is time consuming, everybody took it for granted. And today it's become luxury food. I mean, it's old-fashioned bistro cooking, which I absolutely adore, um, is now sort of bracketed into almost like museum-like restaurants in Paris, and it's easier to have some pasta because anybody in the kitchen can dump pasta into boiling water, or salmon tartare, or things that require people don't know why today's menus in Paris are the way that they are. It's not just because that's what people want to eat. There's an accountant with a sharp pencil behind every menu. And, so that a lot of that really luscious food like blanquette de veau or bœuf bourguignon, all of those long simmer dishes become rarer and rarer and rarer on Paris menus today, but they were all over the place when I first.
When you arrived here in 86, what restaurant from that time, the late 80s, that's not around anymore should listeners know about and why?
Well, one of my favorite restaurants was right on the Quai d'Orsay. It was called the Quai d'Orsay, and it was one of the first places that I ever went and had a meal by myself, which was quite an experience because I did not come from a culture where people went to restaurants alone. Well, I had to sort of pull myself together to go. Finally decided, this was a seminal moment in my French life. It was Saturday night, and I was living on a company expense account, and suddenly it dawned on me that it was pretty pathetic to be scarfing down an omelet in a cafe and rushing back to my hotel before I went out to do a tour of the gay bars. And so I bought a whole bunch of guidebooks, and I decided that I would go to one restaurant. The specialty was mushrooms. So I thought, well, this sounds rather good. So I called, made a reservation, and off I went. And that was on the it was on the Quai d'Orsay on the left bank. I loved that place. I also used to like Le Recamier, which is in the Rue Recamier, also on the left bank. It was a Burgundian restaurant, and the owner was a wonderful man with a fantastic wine. He taught me so much about wine. Um, Martin Cantagri, his name was. And my all-time favorite was La Providence, which was an Alsatian restaurant in the Rue de la Sordière. And Monsieur Schweitzer owned that. And he sort of took me under his wing. And I never had Alsatian things before, but I mean, he'd do Flammkuchen, he'd do bake-off, he'd do, different things, all the Alsatian foods. And he was the one who said to me, Alec, you have such interest in food. You have to learn the regional kitchens to really understand what French cooking is. And he said, the regional restaurants of France, he said, you should be assiduous about this. You should learn Southwestern French cooking. You should, Gascon cooking or Basque. And you'll have great fun doing it, and this will keep you busy, and he was right. I mean, it was fascinating to me. And unfortunately, the regional restaurants have become scarce. I mean, it's that many of them aren't there anymore, but they were much more common when I first arrived.
Restaurants around the world now have closed due to the pandemic. What are some of the most important restaurants that we've lost since the pandemic in Paris?
Paris has fared relatively well, actually, I think, Andrew. I was recently in New York, which really was slammed by the pandemic. And my great fear there was just that one of my all-time favorite places, which is an oyster bar in Grand Central Station called the Oyster Bar. It looked for a while that would go under, but happily no. I think that where things are difficult in many major cities right now, they've lost their business clientele. People have not gone back to work in offices. So, and also tourism. Tourism came to a stop. So in a city like London or New York or Sydney or whatever, that combination of things has made it really, 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 really rough going for restaurants. And I think that post-pandemic, we don't know what post-pandemic is yet because we're still in the middle of this miserable thing. But I think that it's changed the way we think about food. I mean, I've never cooked so much in my life, which is flawless, And I say that as someone who loves to cook. But I used to go out 5 nights a week, and driven back, pushed back on my heels, and having to rely on my own resources has changed the way that I think about food. It's been wonderful, frankly. I mean, I have a keener palate, because I think this happened. What happened to me happened to all of us, which is you cooked all the things you're good at and you like, and then you cooked them a second time, and then you thought, well, bloody hell, what am I going to do now? Because I mean, how often can I eat this? um, and so I started diving into Asian cooking in a way that I'd never done before. And when I finally did start going back to restaurants, I've never felt so humble sitting at the table, because my appreciation of what actually, and I've always been very humble because I've worked in restaurants. I've worked in the dining room, and I've worked in kitchens, in doing very menial work, but also doing like sous chef stuff. I did that illegally as a student in London, and I did that in New York and in seaside hotels in New England when I was a college student. Um, I have enormous respect and admiration for professional chefs. It is People take it so much for granted, and I hope that that there'll be a awakening and a new appreciation of the actual work of professional cooking, because it's really hard. I mean, it's one thing for me to slap something together, um, just for me and Bruno, my husband, but imagine doing that for a room of 50 people on the other side of a swinging door. I mean, it's one of the hardest jobs in the whole world, aside from being an eye surgeon. I mean, I think that's
Lyon has Bocuse, or had Bocuse. Eric Ripert grew up, so to speak, in Provence or Marseille, I think it was. Rubichon came from my home region, actually, Poitou-Charentes and the Vienne. Who is the most influential chef, do you think, from or to come from Paris?
Parisians. I mean, Paris is often a place that people go to shine. I mean, whether it was Ducasse or I mean, Guy Savoy, who's from the Southwest originally, or Christian Constant moved up there from the Southwest. One of the most profoundly Parisian chefs is Yannick Alino. I mean, Yannick grew up in the suburbs of Paris. He has a familiarity with the produce of the Ile-de-France back in the days before World War II, when that beltway of little towns that surround Paris nourished the city, which is why so many French recipes have the names of those towns. And you would know that, for example, Crécy always means something with carrots, because the town of Crécy was where the carrots were grown that went in, were taken in horse carts into Paris to Les Halles and other markets. He knows all of that, and he has a really interesting and very incisive, curious, encyclopedic knowledge of the real cooking of the Ile-de-France and of Paris itself.
What's your favourite restaurant to eat at in Paris?
Gosh.
You have to give us one. You dodged that question earlier when I asked you about the oldest. So now I want your favourite, and we have to have at least one, please.
Well, there's so many places that I love to eat in Paris that I mean, there's a bistro, it would be, gosh, there's so much to eat. There's a bistro that I love called L'Assiette, which is in the 14th, and he's a fabulous cook, David Rathgeber. Um, it's a charming restaurant, and the menu is excellent traditional bistro food, along with, on the other side of the menu, really, really superb contemporary French dishes, including a lot of seafood. I love all seafood. I am an avid seafood, and I don't think I've ever appreciated it more than I have since I've lived in France, because France has all these different coastlines and a culture of exigence, and the quality of the fish is absolutely extraordinary. So, going to a place like Le Duc, which is one of the most famous fish restaurants in Paris, or Désiré, these shockingly expensive but wonderful, wonderful, fancy seafood places. And having, oysters in a saule meunière. I mean, it doesn't always have to be something fancy. I have enormous admiration for this new crop of young talent that's coming along. I think that, and there's some new restaurant czars like Stefan Manigault, who is backing a lot of young chefs, who's doing fabulous stuff. I mean, there's a new restaurant called Granite, which is in the space that was formerly occupied, or Granit, formerly occupied by Daniel Rose in Leal. Daniel Rose is the chef from Chicago, um, who's now back and forth between New York and Paris. But uh, Tom Meyer, the chef at Granit, is an extraordinarily talented young chef. And if you said to me, Andrew, I don't have a lot of money. I'd like to have one meal where I really have an experience of, budding young contemporary French talent. I'd send you to Granit. I think it's an absolutely outstanding
Fabulous.
restaurant.
It's noted. It's on my list and I'm going there. Before we go, I wanted to ask you, there's a period there where everybody had a blog. They wrote about restaurants, left TripAdvisor reviews, checked in on social media. Everyone was a food critic, it seemed. How has the art of writing restaurant reviews and being a critic changed, or has it died, do you think? Or is it having a resurgence? There's three questions all in one there.
Well, thanks for
Has it changed? Has it died? Has it made a resurgence?
that. You know what I think? I mean, I think that it's kind of like, the way that I answer this question is I'd say, if I suddenly had a scratchy throat and I think, oh, hell, I hope it's not COVID. And then once I've seen off that it's not COVID, and I think, what do I do? I might look at Google to see what it would be. But I'm not a doctor. I respect expertise. I respect the precision of people who have been doing a job for a very long time, very long period of time, and who are able to offer an opinion that is uh, critical without being just subjective. And there's a difference, but I mean, criticism is whether it's music criticism or theater criticism, what have you, is done on the basis of an enormous, enormous knowledge and expertise. So that I can go to a restaurant, and if I'm writing a restaurant review, there may be dishes that I don't personally particularly care for, but I can see that they've been exquisitely well made. I mean, and I can put them in the context of what other people have cooked at other points in time, and I can see where the mistakes were made, and I can see where something felt forced and sort of mannerist as opposed to natural. Um, I've been lucky enough, and I think that I'm afraid that I may be one of the last people who was ever lucky enough to have this job, because I was the Paris correspondent for Gourmet magazine for 10 years before it closed, which was the best and most prestigious food magazine in America. And, all my meals were paid for. So I wasn't in that awful twilight zone, which so many people, so many writers today are, of being invited to the restaurant. And then, you go and you think, oh, damn, I can't completely slam it because they've invited me for the meal. Um, and the general public doesn't know any of this. And it is at the same time the world that has never been more interested in food. The economics of publishing are dimming the lights on a lot of serious food criticism, both in newspapers and magazines. It has not been taken up so much on online, which I think is a terrible shame, because I think that people need and want that information. Um, but I think that for someone like me, who has eaten not just in France, but all over Europe and all over the world, really, um, I have had an extraordinary gastronomic education, and I don't know that anybody following my footsteps will ever have that. I mean, because the budgets aren't there, and my going off to write an article on the best grill chefs in Argentina, or whatever it might be. Um, it's very hard for people to swing that. And I also think that we're living in an age of idol smashing. Andrew, I think that there is suspicion, sometimes shading to contempt for expertise, whatever the expertise is. And I think that it's dangerous and wrong. Um, and I think that it does come from the the internet and the fact that everybody's given a voice which they now think is of equal weight. I would never pretend that my voice was of equal weight, for example, in the realm of politics or medical science or anything like that, with people who actually know what they're doing. I just wouldn't. I wouldn't. But I also think that's a question of, it's a question of general cultural literacy as well. I mean, there's the food background, but there's also history and there's geography and there are so many other things that feed into this that I can tell, for example, when I'm reading a food writer. And there are some great people working in the world today. I mean, there's some really wonderful food writing going on. Um, I can tell I can tell that that person is able to put the food, not just in the context of, well, I didn't like it because it wasn't cooked my way or some such, nonsense on TripAdvisor. But to put it in the context of many much broader things and to do, I always say that writing a restaurant review is like writing a short story because it's the food is the foremost thing, of course. But then there's the decor and the ambiance and the service and what have you. And also, I'd like to know what's it actually like to go to the place. Is this a place I would want to go? I mean, if you were going out just for a simple meal, you wouldn't want to show up someplace and find it filled with people wearing suits. There's a lot of information that has to be provided. I look at crowdsourced information like Yelp and TripAdvisor, but it's so angry and indignant half the time. And so much of the time, you read a hotel review on TripAdvisor, and either it goes from somebody saying, the receptionist didn't offer me a welcome drink or whatever it is, to somebody else saying, I love this hotel. There was a bed in the room. And you think, and you have to thresh through to find, it's the search for credibility on the internet.
Hilarious. Finally, the question I ask everyone on Fabulously Delicious, what to you is the most fabulous thing about France?
I think that, the cooking, of course, Andrew, and French food. I mean, French food and French cooking is a reflection of, and the question I'm so often asked these days is people say, well, is France still the world's best country in the Western world for food? And I say hands down, yes. Because there is the technical literacy of French cookery schools is second to none. It's still the basis of what we do in the kitchen in most Western countries. The quality of the products is extraordinary. And there's a level of literacy among the French, excitement and gastronomic literacy among the general French public, which is absolutely, I find it heartwarming. In schools, on the walls, there are maps of France with pictograms of fruit or chickens or whatever, and the children know that, they learn that this thing, the camembert comes from La Normandie and things like that. So there's this transmission of gastronomic heritage, which is absolute genius, even in this great heaving, troubled, ever homogenizing world. France somehow or another manages quite brilliantly to remain the outlier in terms of maintaining its own gastronomic traditions. And but the corollary part of that, I would say, was also the French. I think the French. I have been the student of the French, and they've allowed me to make a home here, and they've allowed me to. I'm not French. I never describe myself as French. But what I love, for example, in the little village where we've been spending time, is that when I go into the post office, I think this sums it up, actually, Andrew. The postmistress just looks up and she goes, bonjour, notre américain. Good morning, or American, which denotes difference, but also, uses the inclusive pronoun. So I adore the French, but the main, I like the country, the people, and of course, most of all, the food.
Fabulous. Alec Lobrano, thank you so much for joining us. Your current book at the moment is My Place at the Table, and I will have a link in the show notes description for this podcast episode for anybody that wants to go off and get a copy of the book. Alec,
thank you so much for joining me today, but also be spending a life around writing about food because, somebody has to, and you've done it fabulously. So thank you very much for that, Alec.
My pleasure, Andrew.
Coming to France? Are you planning a trip to France or Paris even? Or are you one of the lucky ones that live in Paris? Well, I've been lucky enough to live in Paris as well. And I can say this, I pretty much ate my way through Paris for you. So with all that experience of eating, drinking and exploring the city of lights, love and good food, I thought, well, I need to bring that experience to you, my fabulously delicious audience. And what better way to do that than with a book? So I created my first book, a food guide to Paris called Paris, a fabulous food guide to the world's most delicious city. In it, you'll find more than 379 recommendations of boulangeries, cafes, chocolate shops, fromageries, markets, marchés as we call them here in France. Yep, patisseries, restaurants and wine bars. But there's also food streets, gourmet and kitchen supply stores, and so much more. Paris, a fabulous food guide to the world's most delicious city, is available on my website. It's a 2024 edition, which means that it's pretty much up to date with fabulous recommendations for you. And every year I plan on updating it so that each year is a new edition for you. You can get a copy, as I said, on my website, where you can even get a signed and gift package version, or you can go to Amazon, it's available there, and it's even available as a Kindle version. Paris, a fabulous food guide to the world's most delicious city. I hope you enjoy it. That's it for another fabulous episode of Fabulously Delicious, the French food podcast. I hope you enjoyed this look back at all things fabulous about Paris restaurants and what Alec had to say about the topic. If you want to contact me, you can do so via Instagram. Slide into my DMs at Andrew Pryor Fabulously, or you can email me on contact@andrewpryorfabulously.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, you know what my motto is. Whatever you do it fabulously. Merci beaucoup and bon app.